In this new set of videos, I want to focus on a qualitative assessment of news coming from mainland China and how it molded the dynamics of the Hong Kong extradition-bill conflict. The reason being that I feel that Canadians and the rest of the world do not have a complete understanding of the reach and nefarious nature of the Chinese Communist Party's propaganda machine. I think that is because we Canadians take our institutions, such as the free press, for granted, to the point that we're cynical and sometimes distrust them. I want Canadians to realize that for every person believing that the established Western free media is biased or controlled or unfair, they should gaze at what happens in dictatorships such as China to understand what is true control versus what is simply information that one does not agree with. The Chinese state propaganda is so blatant, yet so foreign as a concept to a Westerner's mind, that many tend to dismiss reports of it as far-fetched or improbable lies. With evidences, I hope I can help achieve a few things. Recognize the criticality of a free press, whose role is not to comfort you in your beliefs or blindly support the government, but to give you an account of events and the context in which they play out. Show you how the CCP's propaganda machine works, because China is exporting its propaganda content and tools worldwide, and because 1/6 of the planet's population live under that system, attempt to convince you that this is an international concern that needs to be combated. Through examples, show you how the reporting of a few events in Hong Kong influenced the perception of the conflicts in various countries, in direct relation to how free or controlled their press system is. I posit that the CCP's propaganda machine is so efficient and pervasive that it has created an echo chamber within the CCP that blindsides them on what is really happening in China, the country they need to tighten their control upon.
SARS inception was in November 2002. Patient Zero was a farmer who was treated at a hospital in Foshan and died shortly after. The mainland Chinese health authorities only agreed to internally classify the disease as a potential epidemic 6 weeks later, while it had already spread far and wide. Worse, the epidemic was not addressed publicly until February 11 under the pressure from the World Health Organization, which itself got early warning of a risk from Canada's Global Public Health Intelligence Network from chatter picked up on the internet in China. International network broadcasts about SARS from China from CNN and BBC, among others, were being blacked out, and in April, health officials still insisted that the epidemic was under control. Finally, in May 2003, the Chinese government acknowledged that they had underreported the number of cases. The Beijing mayor and Chinese health ministers were fired. The Chinese Center for Disease Control's director publicly apologized, something that was highly unusual. Once the virus was finally contained in July 2003, over 8,000 cases had been reported, and 775 of these individuals died. If, in 2003, mainland China was not technically prepared to handle an epidemic, the press could not perform its role of bringing the investigative news out because the health authorities were opaque, resulting in delays for coordinated efforts and causing preventable casualties. In other words, the government purposely withheld information, thereby preventing the work of the press. However, and maybe worse, was that it made the Chinese Communist Party lose face. When Dr. Jian Yanyong, retired chief of surgery at a Beijing military hospital, blew the whistle on cases and fatalities in Beijing that amounted to 5 times the figures announced by authorities, he and investigative reporters, while later revealed as heroes in China, got targeted by the CCP. He later antagonized the Politburo when he questioned the 1989 Tiananmen crackdown and was jailed as a result. 2019, the problem is reversed. Where the edict from Beijing is to share the information regarding health crises, the press is so docile and subverted that it hesitates in sharing any information without direct approval from Xi. The net effect, as we will show, is that the same pattern of denial and news containment are repeated as local political authorities, law enforcement, as well as state media fear the central government's reprisal. The onset of the new virus dates back December 8, 2019. As the disease spread, Wuhan officials insisted that it was controlled and treatable. On January 4, 2020, the Wuhan police questioned and punished 8 people for publishing or forwarding false information about the outbreak on the internet. Among these was Wuhan Central Hospital's Chinese ophthalmologist Li Wenliang, who warned of the virus's outbreak back in December 30, 2019. Dr. Wenliang would eventually die from the coronavirus infection on February 7th. A group of Hong Kong journalists, including TVBs, went to the Wuhan hospital that took in most coronavirus patients. The police detained them for hours. They were asked to delete their TV footage and hand in their phones and cameras for inspection.
The authorities are sending a signal, which is that only the government agencies can talk about the epidemic. All other people should just shut up. It's not public disclosure, it's a naked information monopoly.
We can also see evidence of the unease of the mainland's medical authorities and the state media in presenting dire, yet realistic prognostic in the time lag of case reporting. Hong Kong, meanwhile, has been a lot more upfront and quick to do so, as the press and the medical community here do not have to bow down to top-down pressure to contain information. On January 9th, the SCMP reported that 48 patients returning from Wuhan were under observation, 25 had been cleared and discharged. At that time, the information from the mainland was only trickling out of the country, where only 59 cases had been reported. It was also widely reported in Hong Kong media that hospitals raised their alert level and stepped up detection measures. Their mainland counterparts, on the other hand, were left mostly with vague news. Wang Guangfa, who heads the Department of Pulmonary Medicine at Beijing's Peking University and battled SARS on the front line in 2003, was interviewed on mainland Chinese state media, stated that the disease was controllable and under control. He was a member of an expert team from the mainland's National Health Commission, which visited Wuhan the prior month to investigate the outbreak. The irony would have him admit a few days later that he contracted the disease. Only when Xi Jinping himself ordered that information can and should flow freely about the new coronavirus did the system open up and the press start to function more or less as would have from day one in a liberal democracy. And even then, in state media, the focus remained on the whereabouts of Xi while a national health crisis was unfolding.
Beijing's top medical advisor, who oversaw China's response to the SARS epidemic 17 years ago, says possibly.
The number of newly diagnosed patients is going down, gradually going down. So that's good news for us. That's what I predict.
Zhong Nishan says the peak of infections may be reached in mid or late February, and he says things could get significantly better in China by April. But Beijing has changed the way it counts confirmed cases, which makes some suspicious of the declining numbers.
When everything else fails, the head of the dictatorship reverts to what it knows to be working, pushing the great nationalistic story of one people coming together against all odds, vanquishing the enemy for the stability and glory of the motherland. And the state media is all too happy to align to the reality-distorted narrative, not that there is much of a choice anyway. Crucial, of course, for the propaganda to work is for the rogue citizen journalists to be silenced as agitators and dangerous fearmongers. Then, of course, something that always works as a diversion of focus from the failure of the regime, the true root cause of the pandemic, is to blame the black hand of the US. A telltale sign that the CCP is losing control over its message.
The government has tightened its grip on the internet, the media, and civil society. It has deeper pockets and a greater ability to control the flow of information across the country. As a result, many of the media outlets, advocacy groups, activists, and others who held the government accountable in 2003 have been silenced or sidelined. The system is successful in that it destroyed the people with integrity, the institutions with credibility, and a society capable of narrating its own stories. What's left is an arrogant power, a bunch of messy information, and many fragile, isolated, and angry individuals.
These events highlight the obvious truth. Without a free press, free of government financial, political, and legal pressure, Not only are citizens limited in their abilities to know and question what their governments do, but they are also put physically at risk as the press cannot act as the reliable and primary source of actionable news. And the government cannot be trusted to be that reliable source, as it is in direct conflict with its own interests.
Just imagine that in Canada, the government would move the entire population of a city to internment camps because they are Muslims. They would go through Reeducation, thought of how great the government is and that they would abide by the teachings of its Prime Minister and how they are wrong to believe in Allah. They would only be allowed out once they are converted. Some would say that's what we did with the First Nations centuries ago, and there is some truth to it. But that's what about it isn't. The question is, could it happen in Canada in 2020? Absolutely not. But let's suppose it did. The Canadian media would be all over it. Maybe some extreme fringe online media outlets would support it. However, the vast majority of media would decry it as going against Canadian ethics and principles. And all major media outlets would report the information from first-hand investigations. They would not be the government's mouthpiece. That is what a free press does, and it is one of its primary benefits to society, to offer a check on power and to question it. Not in China. That is exactly what happened to the Uyghurs, a Muslim ethnic minority living in China's northwest province of Xinjiang.
实际上，我们这个中心啊，是一所这个寄宿制的学校。
But look even closer. This line is one facility's perimeter wall. And these shadows, they're cast by watchtowers along the wall. This compound isn't a school or a factory. It's an internment camp.
Detention camps designed for Muslim ethnic minorities, like this one, outside the city of Kashgar. What China calls a job training site to us looked a lot more like a prison. High walls, barbed wire, guard towers, things multiple experts told CNN are telltale signs of detention centers. Images like this are rare. Few people have seen camps like this up close because China's government tries to prevent reporters like us from seeing them. A police officer soon reminded us of that fact.
What's happening here is that this police officer does not want us to film, but what we believe is that that's a camp right there. This is as close as we've been able to get. And right over there, we believe are family members, presumably, who could have family members inside that camp, and they're waiting to see them.
China says it has nothing to hide here, but not only do they obstruct attempts to film or go inside the camps, they also prevent us from speaking to those who know anything about them. We tried to talk to this man who just brought food to his brother, who he says is being held in the camp. But before we could ask about life inside, plainclothes security surrounded us and told the man to be quiet.
We had to sing songs hailing the Communist Party. We had to repeat in Chinese, "Long live Xi Jinping."
And the replacing of faith and cultural identity with a different loyalty. I love the Communist Party of China, this man has written.
3 guards surrounded me and abused me.
Мен аяғыма кісен салды да, басында кіргенде бір жеті менің аяғымда кісен жүрді. Ал енді әдетте бұлай ұрып кеткендер өзімнің басымнан да өтті. Мені өзімді де ұрып кетті, тоқтай. Басымнан сол лагерде жатқан кезде, егер қай-қайсың аузыңнан шығатын болса, сендер бұдан да қиын жерге кетесіңдер деп алдын ала келіп ескертеді. Сол себепті жаңағы о жердегілердің бәрі қорқады да, солардың айтқаны бойынша істейді. Енді далада билеп, ән айтып деген сияқты.
Indoctrination of Muslims.
How this happens is outlined in meticulous detail in these secret documents, including a record of a 7-day sweep in June of 2017 in which more than 15,000 people were picked up off the streets and sent to these so-called education centers. But make no mistake, the orders in here are clear. These are prisons. Those inside must spend at least a year in them.
One document is a series of decrees on how to maintain security. Prevent escape is the first and a repeated priority, especially during class, eating periods, toilet breaks, bath time, and medical treatment. That includes full video surveillance coverage of dormitories and classrooms free of blind spots, as well as a rollout of secret forces to prevent people from joining forces and causing trouble.
他们安居乐业，享受着宪法所规定的宗教信仰自由，所以呢，根本不存在你刚才提到的一些报道当中说的所谓的新疆维族人的问题。
Albanian-Canadian historian Olsi Azeshi sees in the documents echoes of what he saw for himself. Once doubtful of the detention of reportedly mostly Uyghurs, he recently asked for and got an official tour. His videos of smiling students, seemingly learning Mandarin, dancing, initially fit the government narrative.
The Chinese told us they have brought Islamic extremists. So we were expecting to find here suicide bombers, terrorists, killers. What have these students done to be here?
But the more he asked uncomfortable questions,
what is her mistake? Why is she here?
The more he realized this was all a show.
Their answers surprised us a lot. Somebody had prayed to God in public. Another one had put a hijab or a headscarf. They were not extremists. They were not terrorists. They were normal people who believed in their God.
You insist on this question?
Yeah. Official translators told him some of his questions were out of line. And when he noticed an odd wound on a woman's hand, an official interpreter became fed up.
You can give me 2 million to rescue her. Really? Because you are so nice.
He realized they could not leave. They'd been forced to confess supposed crimes.
In these centers, what they are doing is exactly what we read in George Orwell's novel 1984. These are mass brainwashing centers.
And back on the streets of Xinjiang, the homes of the roughly 1 million detained are sometimes locked. Signs telling all the disappeared residents are being looked after. Now the world is realizing just what that means.
So how does China respond? Well, the BBC, one of the partners in the China Cables project, put the basics of the authenticated documents to the Chinese ambassador to the UK. Here's reporter Richard Bilton.
Hundreds of thousands of people are held in these camps across Xinjiang. They're held there without sentence, without even charge, and they will be there for at least a year before they're released. That doesn't. They will be in those camps at least 1 year.
The document, so-called document you're talking about, is a pure fabrications. Don't listen to fake news. Don't listen to fabrications.
In some of the places we're being taken to, the satellite images show that the internal security fencing and what look like watchtowers were taken down shortly before the tours for journalists began. And empty exercise yards have been transformed into sports facilities on full display when we visit. But if these are show camps, what might that say about the places we're not given access to? With their watchtowers and barbed wires still in place, they look much less like schools. And we're much less welcome. They've been convicted of no crime, faced no trial. But we're told, China now believes it can determine their guilt in advance.
有些人他没有去杀人的时候，但他已经表现出一种特征，很可能这个人，在过几个星期他去杀人。那么我们是等他犯罪之后，来处理呢，还是说最好在他进行犯罪活动之前，就制止他？
重要的问题，我从一个，走向犯罪边缘的一个人，一个轻微的违法犯罪分子，我回到了正常的社会状态，成了一个遵纪守法的公民。
The important point here is to recognize the pattern of how the state propagandists support Xi's regime. Information comes out of China that there are re-education camps where China massively locks up Uyghurs on arbitrary basis so ridiculous as wearing a beard. China denies there's any camps. Proofs are then presented. China said there are working camps and there are not a lot of people there. State media supports with propaganda. Then leaks show that there are indeed re-education camps and there are hundreds of thousands of people that are brainwashed through them. Finally, China says it is working great and it has reduced terrorism, and then state media supports with propaganda.
You can check for yourself on the Chinese state media channels of Global Times, Xinhua, and CGTN on YouTube. Not a single video is even remotely close to criticize or even question anything that is being done by the Chinese government in Xinjiang. And the 3 secret documents were leaked to the foreign press. Why is that? Well, all of these news outlets are owned and controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. Even the tone is telling. Western propaganda of Xinjiang camps rebutted. What is Western propaganda? As if the Western media from all countries were a monolithic bloc. We'll see later that it is not, by a long shot, and therefore there cannot be such a thing as a Western propaganda machine. However, China's state media is, speaking in a single controlled voice, a single message to the glorious achievements of Xi Jinping and the Communist Party of China.
Those are but a few examples of how the lack of a free press in China is not only dangerous to its own people, but also poses a threat to the world if unchecked. It is not a matter of opinion either. A free press is essential to a free and safe world. I could have covered in details many more examples, but I will leave it up as an exercise to the audience. You might make a point that all media are inherently biased, and therefore Western media doesn't provide more reliable and complete information than Chinese one. It is a weak point, because even though bias might exist, not only it would have to be shown that it significantly impacts the quality of the information being spread, but also that there's cohesion between all the media outlets to propagate the same narrative, which, in a capitalist system where the most followed media is provided by the private sector, is ludicrous. Media conglomerate, you will say? Yes, but then again, rarely across all countries with free press. The idea is that truth invariably and intrinsically comes out in a system of free press. It also comes out faster, which, as we have seen previously, is key for citizens to take necessary action. First, let's start with one country, the United States of America, and let's see where the Americans get their news from. Mostly from TV and online. Here's the ownership structure of TV broadcasts in the US. Yes, big corporations and a lot of control, but the control is financial, not editorial. And for whoever is watching American politics, it is quite clear that there's plurality of point of views and that critic of the government and the president is not only accepted, but also expected. In the world of radio, we can see a similar situation where a handful of players share the market. However, they are mostly different players than on TV. Hence, it would be near impossible to enforce a single narrative. And online, because of the lower barrier to entry, there are even more players. All these news sources compete for readership or viewership, and the argument of a single point of view and concerted bias simply is undefendable. Don't get me wrong, media consolidation is definitely an issue, and it is being actively debated. However, making the statement that all US news is the same is simply not true. And this is only the United States. When one refers to Western media, the implication is that all of the free world is a unit with a single point of view. This could only be the comment of someone who fundamentally does not understand how the free press in non-authoritarian countries works. I just demonstrated that while there can be high media concentration within one type of media within one country in the West, there's little cross-media concentration and virtually no Western worldwide media concentration. So what about China? There are for sure a large number of media outlets, as would be expected from a country of 1.5 billion people. But the ownership is almost 100% concentrated. Ownership is with the state. Don't mistake it for public media, which is people-funded and editorially independent. State media is state-funded and content-controlled.
Outlets operate under tight Communist Party control. The opening up of the industry has extended to distribution and advertising, not to editorial content. However, there is leeway for independent coverage that is not perceived as a threat to social stability or the party.
The CCP maintains direct control over news media coverage through its Central Propaganda Department and corresponding branches at lower administrative levels that determine the boundaries of permissible reporting. A number of additional government agencies are involved in overall regulation of the media sector. Routinely forbidden topics include calls for greater autonomy in Tibet and Xinjiang, relations with Taiwan, the persecution and activism of the Falun Gong spiritual group, the writings of prominent dissidents, and unfavorable coverage of CCP leaders. In addition to these standing taboos, the CPD and provincial censors issue secret directives on other subjects that are communicated almost daily to website administrators and periodically to traditional media editors.
Still don't believe it? Let's hear what the leadership of the Communist Party of China has to say about media control.
The first social responsibility and professional ethic of media staff should be understanding their role clearly and being a good mouthpiece. Journalists who think of themselves as professionals, instead of as propaganda workers, are making a fundamental mistake about identity. The party is in charge of the media, and it is not only about media under its direct control, it's about placing all sorts and all levels of media under the leadership of the party, and it should not be done in a way like scratching one's itch through his boots.
The Chinese media gives itself an appearance of legitimacy in its tone and message, which is generally moderate. The editorials play the good cop, bad cop scenario while they are actually supporting a single narrative. It gives the illusion of plurality, which is actually not there. The government official narrative is rarely if ever questioned, and when it is, then it is quickly silenced. As a result, the Communist Party members will frequently lie on national media as they are not accountable. There's very often an emphasis on a struggle of Chinese people and the need for people to align on the greater ideals of the party to surmount the historical obstacle. Usage of imagery meant to rattle nationalistic Chinese sentiments is prevalent. Now that I have hopefully demonstrated how untrustworthy the Chinese state media is and how the party controls the message and the Chinese people, I invite you to watch the next few videos in this series where I explore how it played out in Hong Kong in their coverage of the 2019 anti-extradition bill citizen uprising.